And the London Psychogeographical Association was probably the first of a kind of whole series of groups that built. This was a mate of mine, a guy I'd met called Richard Essex. I first met him in 1979 at London Workers Group, where I went along when I was 17. He's about 8 years older than me, where we were engaged in a very serious project of trying to synthesise the best of the rival German and Dutch democratic council communist traditions with those of the Italian left, the Borghese traditions, which were a bit more like a headbanging super Leninism. So we wanted to kind of put these two things together and make the best kind of communism out of it. So this is where I knew this guy from. And one of the groups, I mean, it's amazing because you hear all these art world people talking about people now. I mean, when I was 17 and first went to London Workers in 79, they were talking about Tony Negri, well before, you know, kind of Empire or whatever. And also that's where I first came across the Situationist International, who are particularly interesting for me because they cross this kind of cross between an interest in avant-garde art practice, very much coming out of Garde and Surrealism, with councilist left communist traditions. I mean, they're not familiar on the whole with the Italian Borghese tradition. And I got very fascinated by the Situationists. My friend Richard was very interested in them. And as Alex mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, my book, Assault on Culture, was seen as an early, which came out in 1988, an early work on this kind of area of things. I'd say only early in English. I mean, Mirella Bandini did a book in Italian in, I think it was 77, and there were French books on the Situationists and the Electrists in the 60s. I'm trying to remember the husband and wife, Ellen and someone else, Brow, did a book in the mid-60s which showed it in French in the British Library, but there was less information in English. But by the kind of after the late 80s, there was my book, then the following year there was a Graham Marcus book, and also that following year there was a show that went to the Pompidou Centre, started at the Pompidou Centre, went to the ICA in London, and then went to the Institute of Contemporary Arts, the ICA in Boston, America. And I mean, that show was very interesting. I saw it in Paris, and then it came to London, and in Paris it ended with May 68 to kind of tailor it to a French market. In London it ended with punk rock and post-punk fallout, which included some of the stuff I'd been involved with, to tailor it to a British market. And in America it ended with simulationist paintings, you know, American painters, to tailor it to kind of postmodern art, to tailor it to an American market. And from there you started getting a lot of academic interest in the Situationists. My friend Richard Essex, who I think it's quite impressive actually, he went to Cambridge to study philosophy and he got thrown out. And then he went to the LSE to study sociology. This would have been in the 70s when he could keep getting grants, and he got thrown out. So he had a bit of a bugbear about academics. And he pointed out to me he'd been rereading Deboer's introduction to the Italian edition of the Society of the Spectacle, in which Deboer said something along the lines of the only useful theory is an unacceptable theory. And he's going, you know what I think is really unacceptable to academics? The occult. So he lived on the Isle of Dogs. At this point I lived in Poplar, which is the mainland bit in East London here the Isle of Dogs goes down from. So it was just a brief cycle ride over the Blue Bridge to go down and see my mate Richard, and we kind of get drunk, which is crucial to a lot of Situationist activity, getting drunk with drink bottles of wine and have these conversations. And he was wandering around the Isle of Dogs while Canary Wharf was being constructed, and I was getting very pissed off with Canary Wharf as well, because the tower block I was living in Poplar, on by the side of the Global Tunnel Northern Approach Road. When I moved in, I was at the top of the block and I had a lovely view of the Thames out my window. They built Canary Wharf in the way of it, so I wasn't too happy. But anyway, he noticed, I mean, I'd read when I was a kid as well, and he'd looked at Alfred Watkins, the old straight track, and got it, you know, as a child being interested in ley lines. People are familiar with ley theory, presumably. But if you're not, I mean, basically you have you line up ancient objects in a straight line, and when each is assigned a value, like a church or a Neolithic stone or whatever has a value, and when you have a certain value, then that counts as a ley line. And then you can get into arguments about cartomancy, because if people are doing this on a map and not taking into account the curvature of the Earth, they're clearly not serious. But anyway, what my friend Richard Essex had noticed was that there was a ley line that actually came in to England near where the Battle of Hastings took place, travelled through London, went through the kind of down the main path of the Greenwich Park, which is one of the most spectacular parts in London with a big drop, through the statue of General Wolfe, carried on through the Queen Anne House, went across to the Isle of Dogs on the other side of the water. And if you imagine the Canary Wharf Tower as a virtual pyramid, because you have a pyramid shape on the top, and you brought that pyramid down to the ground, went along the side of this pyramid and carried on until it went out of the British Isles on the Isle of Lewis in the Western Isles in Scotland, where the oldest chess set in Europe, or possibly the world, I can't remember which had been found. Now you could go up to Greenwich Park and you could see this sideline was there, and whether that was, you know, whether there's anything mystical about that, or whether that's just because architects like things to line up and look nice, it's an argument you can get into. But he started developing a whole theory around what was happening on the Isle of Dogs with that Canary Wharf development. And he decided to set up the London Psychogeographical Association. Now, the reason for the LPA, which was set up in 1992, was that when he wanted to mess with the history of the Situationist International to stop academics kind of getting so into it. This wasn't entirely successful. But when the Situationist International was founded, there was a series of complex negotiations between various European avant-garde groups, and the nuclear artist Enrico Barge were expelled just before the Unification Conference. So they ended up with the International Movement for an Imaginist Powerhouse, which was essentially Ashley Yorn's group with no one else in it, and the Lettist International, which was essentially a Parisian group who had some Algerian members, but Algerians who lived in Paris. And another guy who was knocking around was a guy called Ralph Rumney, who was a curious English painter, lived all over the place. So he was at the founding conference of Cosio de Rosa in Italy, and they told him he was forming the London Psychogeographical Association just to kind of make it sound like they had three organisations from different places rather than only two. Because the avant-garde always historicises itself, so if I'm talking about things I was involved with, although I'm a little bit off centre here. And if you go back to Garde, some of the early histories are by people like Richard Hulsenbeck, who was an important Berlin Gardeist. And if you go to Fluxus, for example, the kind of neo-Garde group of the 1960s, started with the Constantine Peace Bargain in 1962. George Maciunas is the key figure in Fluxus and the organiser, but there's a guy who's more peripheral called Ken Friedman, who was involved in the group and did a lot of the early historical work on the group, who are now quite important in terms of kept in art museums. And he produced this fantastic system for working out who was important in Fluxus. Again, a bit like ley lines, where you would assign participation in different things of value, and you add it all up, and the person with the highest number is the most important person in Fluxus. So George Maciunas came out top in Ken Friedman's system, and Ken Friedman came out second. I was very, very impressed by that. Anyway, so he set up the LPA, this friend of mine, Richard Essex, and again we talked a lot when we've been in London Workers and then got split and gone through other groups. We had a lot of discussions about communist organisation, and I was having these drunken conversations, and we decided that the best form of communist organisation was to have an organisation with one person in it, because then it couldn't split. So essentially the London Psychogeographical Association was Richard Essex. Unfortunately, it fell apart after its 5-year project, because he had a schizophrenic split with himself and became Richard Bussex and Richard Essex.